overview of what we look to achieve within this part. So to start us off, for the first discussion, we are going to take a look at Dad legacy and lessons. So let's move over there. And again, for those of you guys that are new, here is the legacy and lessons info card to give you a bit of a sense of what's going on. So today's topic for the info card is from a video we'll check out in a sec, but I'll give you the topic title. So who told us? You ready, Dad? So the topic title is, let me put the info card away. Who told us we had to pick one when yes and yes was always an option?
Okay. That makes,
Right?
yeah.
So who told us to, so that idea of,
right, mutually exclusive,
exactly.
each time something that's one thing to happen. For one thing to be true, the other has to be false. Sometimes both of those things.
Right. So here's this. So here's the hook that we're going to introduce as for context. So some of us were raised to believe success means sacrifice, pick the safe route or the risky one, but never both. But what if that framing was the real limitation? Right? There's a quiet power in asking why not both, not because it's easy, but because some legacies are built by refusing to see the world in either or. So we're going to take out the YouTube short that is.
Do I prioritize?
That inspired that topic. So we'll take a look at it here and then we'll get into the conversation.
Investing or building an emergency fund? What would you prioritize your savings on, emergency fund and investment? My answer is yes. I have this philosophy called yes and yes. And I first noticed it when I was in high school. And I remember I got these college applications from all these colleges, and they have an FAQ at the end. And these were pretty selective colleges. And they would say, question, should I take the easier class and get an A, or should I take the harder class and get a B? That was the question. And the college's answer was, well, we always encourage students to take the more challenging class. But in our experience, the students who come here take the more challenging class and they get an A. And I was just like, oh my God, bow down. I respect that. Because they're just saying, look, we're looking for the best. And the best tend to do yes and yes. So sometimes when I hear people say, should I do A or B? My answer is just yes. Do I prioritize investing or building?
So that is the short.
That's deep.
Yeah. So that is the first short. So for context. So again, just to bring back the topic, again, who told us we had to pick one, yes and yes, when yes and yes was always an option? So we'll start off the conversation, Dad, with me asking you this question. Were you ever told to play it safe and even when you felt capable of more? So I'll ask that again. Were you ever told to play it safe even when you felt capable of more?
Okay. That's very, well, I think maybe not directly, but indirectly, my entire life, people have been telling me to take it safe. Like, for example, I'll give an example. Like, growing up in school, I kind of learned anything pretty quickly. So most people, even my teacher was saying, you need to become a doctor, when I wanted to learn how to trade and to invest, right? Because doctor somehow, especially in the Caribbean or maybe even Africa, I don't want to speak for the Africans who are living in Africa, but I can speak maybe more clearly for Jamaicans. Like, most of our parents and even my teacher at the time would want to say, yeah, you need to become a doctor, even though I wanted to learn finance and try to predict the market and things like that. So I think that my entire life, even though it's not, I can't remember somebody directly trying to tell me what to do outside, one of my teachers, Sister Philomena, that says, you're so good in physics and chemistry, you should probably become a doctor or something like that, right? Mm-hmm. But I think the entire life experience is usually telling you that indirectly, or you're absorbing that through osmosis.
And I think is that a Canadian experience? Is there a Western experience? Is it different in Jamaica? I feel like again, for someone who hasn't traveled too much outside of Canada and the United States, when it comes to the yes and yes, I agree with the direct, indirect stuff. So, for example, I grew up playing sports, great, you're in that category. But the moment you start venturing into other sorts of ventures, all of a sudden now you're hearing, oh, just relax, you're doing too much now. I was
Yeah.
always tired of it. I'm sick and tired of it because I remember when I was in business school for university, and I started to work on my ventures day in, day out. People would see me go to the library, go to the caf, go to, a coffee shop and work on my stuff. And they would ask me about it. They said, man, just relax. You're doing well, but just take it easy. But guess what? Guess where I never heard that? In the gym. When I was the first
Right.
one in the gym and the
Exactly.
last one to leave,
Yeah. Yeah.
he's the example. Follow Roy. Call out,
Right.
standing ovations. Look, he's the first one in, last one to leave. Nobody cares. I spent my
Right.
whole life playing sports. All of a sudden, that's all that you do. But the moment you start getting into other ventures and areas, and it's not necessarily a racial thing, though there's that aspect of it, we can get into that. But it's the idea that when you start doing things that a lot of people think is complicated or it's hard for them to do, they start projecting that onto you and try to
Okay.
bring you back in to focus you and be like, hey, man, there's no need for that. When in actuality, a lot of those things, the yes and yes, is required, right? So the idea, and that's one of the
Yeah.
things I look to instill in my kids, which I think you've done that too, the idea that you don't have to accept what is told to you. And actually, I think one of the interesting things that you had done growing up is that you made us challenge even your authority, which sounds
Right. And your mother.
it sounds counterintuitive to raise
Yeah.
your kids to challenge you when really, as a parent, you want to obviously have your kids have certain values, but selfishly and unselfishly in some aspects, you don't want to make your life hard. And I think for a lot of parents, one of the things that makes their life hard is their kids challenging them or not listening to them. And I feel like they think that not listening to them and empowering your kids, a lot of parents want to empower their kids to the point, but up to the point actually, where they're not challenging them, which
Yeah.
it's a weird balance to have when in actuality, you have to be okay with the challenge. And that's what you should
Yeah.
invite. And that's the idea. And the reason I bring it back to the topic of yes and yes is because it is that mindset that when you're looking at a university or you're looking at picking your courses, instead of looking at math as a hard subject, I'm not going to take it. Let me take an arts course. And there are a lot of arts courses that are hard. English is a hard course, for example.
Right.
As an
Right.
academic advisor, so I understand there's a course Psych 101
Yeah.
people think is easy. It's not easy. These are some of the
Yeah.
harder courses that you can take, but the perception is that when you look at those courses, you may choose an art course over a science course, computer science course, or a math course because you think it's easy, because you think you can get a better grade. Where that's a whole different frame of mind for those that were raised to question what is around them and to learn from everything.
Yeah.
Then you'll be able to look at certain subjects and say, you know what, I'm going to take the harder course and I'm going to do well. Why? Because the confidence is
Yeah.
not in the course and your perceived difficulty of the course. The confidence is your ability to problem solve, that you've
Yeah.
challenged things and you know how to learn. And that's where the yes and yes mindset to me comes from. And I think I grew
Right.
up a little bit with that as well.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you
Yeah.
something.
If
Oh,
I,
go ahead. Yeah.
if I just want to say, I just don't want to move too far from the yes and yes, because while I agree with yes and yes, we have to be very careful that we don't stop and say yes and yes, because sometimes the correct answer is no and no, or yes and no,
Mhm.
right? Because there are times when like you and I have a discussion recently, and I think it's relevant to this one earlier this week, where I'm saying whenever you say yes to something, you're also simultaneously saying no to other things,
Yes.
right?
You did say
So
that earlier this week.
right. So when you're saying yes and yes, we have to make sure that we're talking about in a very confined context. Yes and yes can make a lot of sense, but sometimes yes and no, or no and no, is equally as good as yes and yes. So we have to be careful we don't get to the bias
So give
of
an example of what
linking
you mean.
yes.
Yeah.
Okay,
I'm
well,
I'm following, but
yeah,
yeah.
okay. I'll give you an example. So imagine that you don't, somebody's telling you that, okay, you should take math because math is very important, and a mathematical mind is required for a lot of different things. And imagine that you wanted to go into law. So and then physics is just close to math as possible, because if you, chances sometimes there's a high correlation close to one. If you're good at math, chances are you'll do a lot better in physics, for example. But you want to go in law. So maybe when you said yes, when you said no to math because you already have the basic math and you don't want to take the advanced math because you're not going to that path, you can take that on your own. Maybe you should also say no to physics. That's an example of saying no to no, when no and no is also correct.
Right.
Right? As correct as yes and yes. So it depends on the path, and it's context driven. So I think one of the things what we have to do, if somebody said yes and yes, we have to say why. Right? For what purpose? For what purpose that yes and yes? So I would challenge that guy a little bit. I'm not saying that I agree in the essence that there are a lot of times when yes and yes, I can do this well, and I can also do that other thing as well. Not because people just think that one is mutually exclusive to the other. Sometimes that's not the case. But there are times when we need to say no and no. And the final thing before you come back, and I want to hear what you have to say here, is there are times when yes and no is also equal, very important, because every time I say yes to somebody, I'm saying no to talking to one of my kids, right? Equally. So if you're just present, you have the presence of mind to recognize that every time you say yes, you better ask yourself, what am I willing to say no to? Because if you kind of go without saying, recognize that you're also saying no to something else. If I, for example, this podcast, if I say yes to this podcast, there's several other things I'm saying no.
Podcast?
Yes. No, just to do it.
Right.
Like, so when we've decided, so yes, we're going to go ahead and do this, I'm going to have to say, okay, there's a couple other things that I'm going to have to say no to because of the amount of work and focus and right. So yes and no, yes and yes, and no and no. And sometimes it's a set, and we have to make sure that we're present to make sure that we know which one of those set is better for our life and success. That's what I want to add to that.
And I agree with that. So here's my thing with that the weight of, I believe that the weight of no, I agree with what you're saying. The weight of no is important. And I think a lot of people don't really see it that way. As far as when you say yes, I know intuitively, and I kind of mentioned this before, intuitively, we understand the idea of opportunity cost, that if you do one thing, and if somebody brings this up to you, if you do one thing, then you can't do that. It's like, oh, well, thank you, Captain Obvious, right? Like if you're going to take a plane to Jamaica, you're not going to take that same plane and go to Mexico. Like that's not right? Exactly. The mutually exclusivity part of it, right? And the opportunity cost of it. But the idea to again, the difference, that is the difference, right? To really understand that when I'm going to say yes to you, I'm saying no to everyone else. Why is that valuable? I think it's a valuable insight because a lot of people have trouble saying no. And apparently there's all these studies that are out there that say, a lot of people are much more happy in life, or gratified when they're able to say no to things. Why? Because they're not committing to things that they themselves don't feel like they want to do or they need to do or what have you, right? All those reasons. So I say that because they're scared to say no, the people pleaser archetype. If they were to understand this insight here, I would think that they would realize that they're saying no every time they say yes. And you see the insight.
Yeah.
And
Right.
And as a matter of fact, not only are you saying yes, but you're saying no 8 times for every yes that you're saying.
Okay.
And the
Yes. Yes.
no is actually weighing. It's more effortful to say no than it is to say yes. So even if it was just a 1-to-1, it's already important. I think you get what I'm saying with that. But
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
so for the people pleaser, that insight really can change the game for them, and especially if those research studies are at all, you could put any weight to it, any validity to it, then that makes sense. Now you're living a happier life because you realize that I'm saying no 8 times right now in order to say yes
Right.
to you. But
I didn't think about it that way.
vice versa, right? But vice
Yep.
versa, big brain, Dad. But vice
Big
versa,
brain.
no, but vice versa, you have the person that you might have been saying yes to. If they understand that you're saying no to all these other things, again, they understand that you could be doing other
Yeah.
things. But if you're able to articulate to them that, I'm going to do this. I was going to do 1, 2, 3, 4. But I'm going to put that aside. I'm going to do this. If you don't have to say it in such a robust manner, but they all of a sudden appreciate your time more, and it just all comes together. So I think
That
that
makes sense.
insight, you can really go deep with it. But you're right, to bring
Yeah.
it closer. Yeah,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
was just going to say to
Yeah.
close that part, just to bring it closer
Yeah.
to the yes and yes.
Yeah. Yeah. The yes and yes. It's that's the good thing about like insights like those.
Mhm.
They usually it's not one thing, it's usually a cluster of things, right? And it's usually a cluster. Like I always say, and when I say always say, I'm not saying I always say, those people that always say, no, I always say this.
Right.
Like a lot of things are like distribution as opposed to prediction or options. You usually have like a group of options, and there's a probability. There's a set of probabilities that you will decide to choose one or the other, right? And it's similar to the yes. The last thing I'm going to touch on this yes and yes point, but as it relates to what you just said earlier, is the yes and the more no you're saying. I agree, but I was thinking more that you're talking to yourself. So that one is when you're talking to someone else, and you could point out like, if I'm going to do this, there's 4 other things that I could have I'm going to have to put aside, right? And maybe they will appreciate if you were to say no. But what I'm talking about is like the what you're saying to yourself subconsciously that is happening, but you're not present. Because the moment you kind of bring things from the subconscious and bring it in present, I think it has a lot more power. So if you kind of acknowledge that when you say yes, yeah, I will go to that party, right? Mm-hmm. That piece of design that you need to work on tonight, that's what you're saying no to. So now you have to make up for that. And once you kind of understand that, either you will cut the party short or you're going to make adjustment for that. So what I was thinking about is more of like a self-talk, like you're talking to yourself and recognizing what your decision, the impact of your decision as it relates to you. But what you've brought out that I wasn't seeing is the other part. So one is like personal and the other part is like social.
Right.
And the impact, and obviously they work together. So I didn't think about that part.
That's it. But this is the Generation Gap, Bridging the Gap podcast. So we kind of get a feel for my thoughts towards the yes and yes. Obviously, you kind of summarized your thoughts and kind of where we are with that. I do want to bring up the generational angles, right? So speaking for the more youthful generation, the elder generations, and so let's kind of bring in some perspective. So I do have some things here that I think would represent those parties, and maybe us speaking on that would kind of help bridge some of these gaps, right? So here's the generational angle that came about for this one here, which is they actually took it a completely different way with this for what I have. It says for the generational trigger, the trigger that would exist between our generations on something like this is that for many, especially from the older generations, this feels impossible.
But 1 second. So I want to make sure that because generation is such a big word, right? And it kind of it's very expansive because it can run from one to,
Right.
from 12-year-old to 80-year-old, and people are living 100. Are you talking about your generation, Kayla's
Yeah.
20 something, 30? What
Yeah.
generation we can
So I
specific?
would say from millennials and so Gen Z, millennials and below, if you want to say that.
Okay.
So you're
Okay.
looking at 35 under.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
think that's kind of a fair thing to
Yeah.
at least a benchmark. So the
Yeah.
trigger that would exist then to use that 35 and under, which 35 over, it says I have here for many, especially the older generations, this feels
Mhm.
impossible. So the idea of yes and yes, raised in environments where choices were finite and paths had to be picked. The idea that both is an option can sound unrealistic, indulgent, and even dangerous. So I'll speak first to the trigger on a generational side, right? Where if you, the yeah, so on the generational side, I'll say that my generation, and I'll just pull it over here for a second. The younger generation has to do more. And this is part of the frustration that exists, for example. When it comes to growing up, the idea that I'll take The Simpsons. The Simpsons was a show on TV, still on a show. I
I
think
think
it's
you're
still
twice. Sorry, I think you're twice. I'm seeing your.
yes, yeah. Yeah, you
The
should.
audience.
Okay, so your cameras, you're good?
Yeah, I'm back.
Yeah. So yeah,
Sorry about that.
this is part of the process. This is why it's episode 2.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
figure things out. So I'm not really worried about any of this stuff. As I told
Yeah.
you, Dad, and I'll say it on the podcast here, it's a father son podcast. There is no losing from that. The fact that we're here and being able to
Exactly.
talk about these things and put these things together, that's already a win. So we'll figure out the rest of the stuff on the fly. But as far as
Exactly.
so where were we? Generation gap triggers. The
Yeah.
younger generation, the idea of yes and yes. The older generation feels like that's too much. That's not realistic, or like you cannot do that. Here's the part where I'll empathize with the other side in this part. I'll empathize with the fact that we grew up in the technological age, right? The dawn of the internet, as far as from a household
Application.
experience, yeah, from a household or application experience. Prior to
Yeah.
that, things were very finite. For example, you can graduate your high school and move 2 hours away in the 80s and never see anybody ever again. For all intents and purposes, you moving 2 hours away to a small town beside where you were is effectively the same thing as you moving to China or across the world. The
Yeah. That's
communication was just as limited, right?
wow.
The decisiveness was there. When you were gone, right? Obviously, you could road
Yeah.
trip, but you're not seeing them. It's a postcard, maybe if it gets there, right? And it's a picture at most. There's no FaceTime. So you had to really think about your decisions. But at the same time, here's where I resonate with this yes and yes. In this generation, you cannot just do, for example, one job and think that you're going to be okay. Those days are gone. And I want to bring up the point of The
Yeah.
Simpsons. When we look at TV, we have to remember, and for generations younger than I am at this point, the Gen Zs and so forth, there was something called prime time slots on TV. So that was when you finished school, there was like the 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock prime time where everybody's able to watch the American Idol slots, things like that.
Oh yeah, that's true.
So
That's
the
so true. I
main,
remember it.
yeah. So the main slots that were taken in those eras were shows that had to appeal to a large demographic. That was the only way for it to be popular enough in order to maintain those slots. The Simpsons was one of those shows that has been able to maintain a prime time slot or been on TV for such a long time. And why is because it appealed to the masses. That's what it was supposed to do. And it's a show about a
Okay.
guy, Homer Simpson, who works a regular factory job, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Remedial job as far as in the intro, he's fumbling the nuclear thing, like he's not proficient at all. Go home, was able to have a house, a 3-bedroom house with a car, go on vacation, a dog, a cat, and he's basically doing the same thing. So in the 80s, 70s, 80s, 90s, you could potentially put a bolt on a car, and that's your job. In 40 years,
You've
have
just
a
been doing
house,
that.
car, vacation, this. We cannot do that. The idea that you can just do a summer job, I heard someone tell me about cutting down trees with their summer job and that paid for the year. We cannot even operate like that. So we have to have a side hustle, have a main hustle, have something else you're trying to do, have this, that. So it's always going to be yes and yes from a framework of if we want to attain anything in life, that's kind of the perspective that I feel like my generation is like, we only know to live like this. And so, I think that's kind of the perspective as far as the triggers.
That's very good. Yeah. I remember seeing Kayla's speech when she went back to your former school.
For those who's Kayla for the.
Kayla's my youngest daughter.
Yeah.
Yeah. You have to bring Kayla and Shantae and Chad. Right. You have to bring all of them on the show one of these days to get their perspective and things too. But she was talking about that very thing where she was saying this idea that you can't do two things at once, right? Or you can't do two things well. It's just not true, especially even universities these days, school, because me and university. I'm pro education, but somewhat anti-establishment in certain respect. I think obviously they have value in certain areas, but I think they're like pimping the brains of the young people. But she was saying something similar, that they shouldn't just do one thing. And I noticed that some of the universities, or maybe at this point, maybe pretty much all of them, they start having what's called cross-functional degrees. Like you yourself got not just business, but business with communication,
philosophy and
systems, right? Yeah. So they kind of start combining these things. And I would even add to your point that when a person is very good at one thing, that's not possible that a person can be good at one thing. Usually you're good at many things and you kind of target them to one thing. Right. So I will challenge any. Yeah.
So I know, trust me, I know where you're coming from. We see a lot of the things the same, but from a generational standpoint, I think that's kind of where, the younger generations and my generation, like, what would you say in defense or to bring up their points? Because they're not here right now in this discussion. So their perspective is I would think, like, for example, they had to do what they had to do. They didn't have the internet, right? When they moved, there was a decisiveness that I think the older generation has, because you had to have it. There was like for example, I'll give you another example, the library. You don't have what we have the luxury to have a school assignment and wait till the last 2 days in order to actually get something done. If you didn't go to the library, figure out what you want, go to the library and get that book, guess what? You got a new subject. You're going to have a new topic because you don't have your source to do any of that stuff. You hope that they're able to return it when they say that they're supposed to return it to the library, right? Like, so there was a clarity I think the world forced you to have, even as far as apps, right? Like we have Scotiabank and TD and all the bank apps on our phone. I remember just being young, having to stop by, with you and mom, have to go by the bank and wait for you guys to go in. And if there's a line, right? For an hour, to do a transfer, to do anything. There's no taking picture of so you have to really time out your day and your week and your life. So there's a focus there where you had to choose daily. You couldn't do everything. But
well, that's why it shouldn't be a comparison. Not every time you can compare one to the other. Because if the context is so different, just by comparing them, you can't so again, you're comparing groups of things. So most things are not just a single thing. It's usually a set of things that comes together. So when we're doing like the comparison, they could focus on just one thing. We have to also take in consideration all of what you just said, the context, right? The context is that if you're not good at one thing, you're not going to be promoted. You're just not, because the education system, even up to when you were a kid, which is not that's not very long, most things were so specialized that if you're not really good at one thing, nobody is going to employ you, right? So we have to really, when we're trying to analyze these things, I think we have to kind of step back and see and ask a few questions like, is it even possible to do a fair assessment? Having said that, the challenge is when people my age and older that take our context from the 80s and 90s and then kind of bring it forward and then try to impose that and superimpose that onto our children when the context is rapidly changing and has changed dramatically, exponential change in the last couple of years. I'll give you an example. I know somebody who has
give you the last the wrap up on this. You get to put the bow on this segment.
Okay, so I don't know about no bow. I'm not putting any bow on anything. Okay, so just joking. Okay, let me wrap it up. Okay, so I know a person who has a son, and he got a job. Right, he finished his university, went back to college, studied computer science at the college. Studies, I can't remember his degree, and then he got a job for the government. And the first day, and the job was like more or less service based, right? You look up, respond to the customer and things like that. And then when he got to work for the first week, they said, okay, you know that your responsibility is not going to only be this, but you have to learn WordPress and manage our WordPress server. And by the way, you have to manage this other thing, and so on, right? So imagine if our older person was telling him, only learn one thing. Look at the problem that it would be in. So that's the challenge for older people my age, is to, even though we know when back then it made perfect sense to do what we're doing because that was the environment and the context that we're in. The challenge is to make sure that we're not bringing that forward and pretending like nothing has changed, because everything has. That's it.
That's the
metaphor. Wrap up. Yeah, exactly.
With that. So that, guys, that would be the.
Do I prioritize?
Oh, let's bring that back. Yeah, so that would be the legacy and lessons first segment there. This episode here, we're not even going to focus too much on the timing. Eventually, those things will come, right?
Yeah, we'll get it tight.
Yeah, we'll get the timing. We'll get kind of more. But just to have you understand that we want to have the conversations. These are conversations my dad and I have all the time, right? And so we're just putting it in a podcast format. And we realize a lot of the stuff is on many different topics, many different subjects, many different ways to add value. I would also say that I had a point there. What was the point? You know where I was going with
You're asking me?
Yeah, I'm asking. Anyways, I don't know. So that was the first segment. I'll remember it. If it's important, I'll remember it.
If it's important to come back, yeah, exactly.
Moving on.